The stars had never seemed so cold as they did that day when Captain Ryan Mitchell stood on the bridge of the horizon. His ship cut through the darkness of space, searching for something that had been lost 12 years ago. The Colonial Dawn had disappeared with 5,000 people on board, and nobody knew what happened to them. Now, after all this time, they had picked up a signal. Ryan was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had spent 20 years in space, exploring new worlds and charting unknown regions. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to find. Next to him stood Lisa Hammond, his navigation officer. She was young and brilliant, with a sharp mind that could calculate jump coordinates faster than the ship's computer. Danny Price, the chief engineer, worked below decks keeping the engines running. Karen West, the medical officer, waited in the sick bay, ready for whatever they might find. The signal grew stronger as they approached the coordinates. Lisa's hands moved across her console, her face pale in the blue light of the screens. She had a sister on the Colonial Dawn. Her name was Beth, and Lisa had not stopped looking for her since the ship vanished. Every spare moment, every day off, Lisa had searched through old records and scanned distant star systems. Now they might finally have answers. The horizon dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and there it was. The Colonial Dawn floated in the void, intact but dark. No lights showed in its windows. No engines hummed with power. It was a ghost ship, silent and still. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. Something was very wrong. They suited up and crossed over to the lost vessel. The airlock opened with a hiss that echoed through the empty corridors. Inside, everything was in place. Cups sat on tables. Toys lay scattered in the recreation areas. But there were no people. Not a single soul remained on board. The ship was a frozen moment in time, abandoned and quiet. Danny found the computer core still functional. He plugged in and started pulling up the logs. Ryan, Lisa, and Karen gathered around as the first files opened. They saw faces of happy families, children playing, people excited about their new home on a distant world. Then the recordings changed. A date appeared. 12 years ago, 3 months into their journey. The log showed a massive ship appearing from nowhere. It was bigger than anything humanity had ever built, covered in strange markings and glowing with an eerie purple light. A voice came through the speakers, cold and mechanical, speaking in a language the Colonial Dawn's computer struggled to translate. The message was simple. Stop your ship and prepare to be boarded. Captain Stevens of the Colonial Dawn had tried to negotiate. He explained they were peaceful colonists, just families looking for a new home. The alien ship did not care. Armed soldiers in dark armor materialized on the Colonial Dawn, moving through the ship with brutal efficiency. They separated the colonists into groups, men and boys on one side, women and girls on the other. Ryan's hands shook as he watched the recording. The aliens called themselves the Xalthian Empire. They said this region of space belonged to them, had belonged to them for 10,000 years. Any species entering their territory without permission was guilty of invasion. The punishment was death, but not for everyone. They had a special message to send to humanity. The recording showed the Xalthians forcing everyone onto transport ships. Captain Stevens begged them to spare the children. A woman named Amy Brooks, a teacher, tried to shield the young ones. Dr. Helen Carter, a scientist, demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. Claire Watson, an engineer, fought back and was struck down. The Xalthians showed no mercy. Then came the part that would change everything. The final log entry was a transmission from the Xalthian capital world. It showed a public square filled with platforms. Thousands of human women and girls stood on those platforms with ropes around their necks. The Xalthian commander stood before them, speaking to cameras that broadcast across their empire. He declared that this would be the fate of any species that dared enter Xalthian space without permission. These humans would die as a lesson to their kind. Stay away, or face extermination. The platforms dropped. The recording showed every horrible moment. The women did not beg. They did not cry. They sang. They sang songs of earth, of home, of hope. They sang until they could sing no more. Lisa collapsed to her knees. She had seen Beth among them. Her sister had been singing louder than anyone, her voice clear and strong until the end. Karen turned away, tears streaming down her face. She had recognized Julie Martinez, a friend from medical school. Danny's jaw clenched so tight his teeth hurt. Ryan stood frozen, unable to look away from the screen. The transmission continued. The Xalthian commander explained that the men and boys would be taken as slaves. They would work in mines and factories across the Empire. If humanity wanted them back, they would have to submit to Xalthian rule. If they tried to fight, more would die. The message ended with images of human men being loaded into transport ships, their faces hollow with grief and shock. The crew of the Horizon sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance, uncaring and cold. Inside, 4 people tried to process what they had witnessed. 5,000 innocent people had been taken. 2,000 women and girls had been murdered just to send a message. 3,000 men and boys were slaves somewhere in the galaxy. Ryan finally spoke, his voice rough and low. They had to take this information back to Earth. The government needed to know what happened. Families needed to know the truth. As horrible as it was. Lisa carefully copied every file, every recording, every piece of evidence. The data felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the lives it represented. The journey back to Earth took 2 weeks. Nobody slept much. They kept watching the recordings, looking for any detail they might have missed, any clue about where the prisoners had been taken. Danny ran analysis on the Xalthian ship design. Karen documented the faces of everyone she recognized. Lisa composed messages to the families, though she did not know how to explain what had happened to their loved ones. When the Horizon entered Earth's solar system, they sent an emergency transmission ahead. By the time they docked at the orbital station, the United Earth Council was already assembling. News crews waited at the airlock. Military officers stood ready to escort them to the emergency session. Ryan carried the data chip in his pocket, feeling its weight like a stone. The council chambers filled within an hour. Representatives from every nation, every colony, every settlement gathered to hear what the Horizon had found. Ryan stood before them and told the story. Then he played the recordings. The chambers fell silent as the executions played on the massive screens. Grown men and women wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. Some shook with rage. When the recording ended, nobody spoke for several minutes. Then Senator Patricia Hughes stood. She was an older woman, a veteran of the Mars Rebellion, known for her careful diplomacy and measured responses. Her voice did not shake when she spoke. She said that humanity had been attacked. Innocent civilians had been murdered. Citizens had been enslaved. The Xalthian Empire had declared war whether humanity wanted it or not. The vote came swiftly. Every representative raised their hand in agreement. Earth would go to war. They would rescue the prisoners. They would make the Xalthians answer for their crimes. And they would make certain that no one in the galaxy would ever think humanity could be terrorized into submission again. Ryan Mitchell watched the vote and felt something shift in the world around High Earth changed overnight. The morning after the council vote, every news channel showed the recordings from the colonial dawn. People watched in their homes, in public squares, at work. The galaxy had seemed so full of promise and wonder. Now, it revealed itself as dangerous and cruel. The Xalthians had murdered innocent people and enslaved the survivors. General Marcus Cole stood in the war room deep beneath the United Earth Council building. He was a broad-shouldered man with scars from the Mars Rebellion and eyes that had seen too much fighting. He had hoped his war days were behind him, Now he was being called back to lead the largest military operation humanity had ever attempted. Around the table sat the people who would help him plan the destruction of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. Admiral Patricia Hughes had been promoted from senator to military commander in a single day. She knew ships and strategy better than anyone alive. Next to her sat Raymond Bell, a genius engineer who had designed the engines that made faster-than-light travel possible. Dr. Laura Green, a physicist, had been pulled from her research to develop new weapons. They had maps of Xalthian space spread across the table. But those maps had huge, empty sections. Humanity knew very little about their enemy. Marcus looked at the numbers and felt the weight of the task ahead. The Xalthians controlled over 400 star systems. They had thousands of ships and billions of soldiers. Humanity had never fought a war in space. Every military doctrine, every strategy, every weapon had been designed for fighting on planets or in orbital space around Earth and Mars. They were going up against an empire that had conquered dozens of species and ruled for millennia. But Marcus had studied history. He knew that big empires often got slow and comfortable. They relied on their reputation to scare enemies into submission. The Xalthians had tried that. With humanity, they had killed innocent women and children to terrify Earth into staying away. They did not understand who they were dealing with. Humans did not respond to terrorism with fear. They responded with fury. The recruitment centers could not handle the crowds. Jake Morrison was one of the first to volunteer. He was a quiet man who had worked as a cargo ship captain, running supplies between Earth and Mars. His wife had been on the Colonial Dawn. Her name was Linda, and she had been a nurse excited about helping build a new colony. Jake had watched her die on the recordings. Now he stood in line with thousands of others, waiting to sign up for the war. Nicole Grant walked into a military office and demanded to be made a pilot. She was small and fast, with reflexes that made her one of the best racing pilots in the solar system. The recruiting officer tried to explain that combat flying was different from racing. Nicole pulled up her records and showed him she had won every major race for the past 5 years. She could fly anything. Give her a fighter and she would make the Xalthians regret what they had done. Kevin Hayes was already a Marine, stationed on the moon base. When the call went out for volunteers, his entire unit signed up. Kevin was a sergeant, a big man who had trained in every form of combat humanity had developed. He specialized in close quarters fighting, the brutal work of boarding enemy ships and clearing them room by room. He gathered his squad and told them they would be training harder than ever before. They would be the first Marines to board a Xalthian vessel, and they would show the aliens what humans could do. The scientists worked around the clock. Dr. Victoria Lane had been studying plasma physics at the Mars Research Station. She abandoned her academic work and focused on weaponizing her research. Plasma could burn hotter than any conventional weapon. If they could generate it in large enough quantities and direct it at enemy ships, it would cut through armor like paper. She had 6 months to turn theory into reality. Andrew Ross worked on shields. The Xalthians had energy barriers that could stop projectiles and absorb laser fire. Humanity needed the same technology. Andrew had examined the fragments of a Xalthian probe that had crashed on Europa decades ago. The probe's shielding system was still partially functional. He tore it apart, studied every component, and started building Earth's first energy shield generator. Dr. Melissa Ford was a chemist who specialized in corrosive compounds. She developed an acid that could eat through Xalthian armor. The military tested it on captured probe fragments and watched the metal dissolve in seconds. Melissa refined the formula, making it stable enough to load into warheads. The Xalthians relied on heavy armor to protect their ships. That advantage was about to disappear. The shipyards worked at a pace that seemed impossible. Admiral Hughes oversaw construction of the fleet from an office that never closed. She slept 3 hours a night and spent the rest of her time reviewing designs, approving modifications, and pushing the builders to work faster. The flagship was named Vengeance. It was bigger than anything humanity had ever constructed, bristling with the new weapons and protected by Andrew's shield generators. More ships followed. The Retribution, the Fury, the Justice, the Reckoning. Each name was a promise. Smaller vessels rolled out of the construction bays by the dozens, destroyers, cruisers, corvettes, and fighters. Every ship was built with one purpose: to destroy the Xalthian Empire, the orbital space around Earth filled with vessels, their hulls still warm from construction, their crews training day and night. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes worked in intelligence. She was a tall woman with a gift for languages and an analytical mind that could spot patterns others missed. Her job was to learn everything possible about the Xalthians. She studied the recordings from the colonial dawn, analyzing every word the aliens spoke, every gesture they made. She built a profile of their military structure, their technology, their tactics. Working with Sophie was Nathan Cruz, a hacker who had once been arrested for breaking into the Mars colonial government's computer systems. The military had released him from prison and given him a new job: break into Xalthian networks. Nathan sat in a dark room surrounded by screens, probing the alien communication systems, looking for weaknesses. He found that the Xalthians used quantum encryption, but their protocols were old. With enough computing power, he could crack them. Dr. Grace Meyer joined the team as a linguist. She had taught ancient languages at university, specializing in how different cultures communicated. The Xalthian language was complex, with layers of meaning that shifted based on context. Grace worked to create a translation system that would let humanity understand everything the enemy said. More importantly, she could teach others to speak Xalthian, which would be crucial for intelligence operations. 6 months into the mobilization, Ambassador Richard Stone was sent to make contact with the Xalthians. He was an experienced diplomat who had negotiated treaties between Earth and the Mars colonies. His mission was to demand the return of the prisoners and offer one chance for peace. The military did not expect the Xalthians to accept. They wanted to see how the enemy would respond. Richard's ship, a small diplomatic vessel, entered Xalthian space broadcasting peaceful intentions. A Xalthian warship intercepted them and brought them to a border outpost. Richard was escorted to a meeting with Commander Vothran, the officer who oversaw this sector. The alien was tall and thin, with gray skin and black eyes that showed no warmth. Richard explained that humanity wanted peace but demanded the return of all prisoners. He offered to discuss borders and trade agreements. He said Earth would forget the massacre if the Xalthians released the colonists and paid reparations. Vothran listened without expression. Then he laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound that made Richard's blood run cold. The Xalthian commander called Richard's demands amusing. The Empire had conquered hundreds of worlds. Humanity was nothing, a young species, barely learning to travel between stars. The prisoners would never be returned. They were property now, slaves who would work until they died. As for the executed women, Vothran said they died to teach humanity its place. If Earth wanted war, the Xalthians would exterminate every human in the galaxy. To prove his point, Vothran showed Richard a recording. It showed human men working in a mine, their bodies thin and scarred. Guards beat them if they slowed down. The conditions were horrible, designed to break their spirits. Richard recognized several faces from the colonial dawn. These were fathers and sons, husbands and brothers. They were suffering, and the Xalthians found it entertaining. Richard returned to Earth with the recording. It was broadcast across all human space. The footage of beaten, enslaved humans being tortured by their alien captors ignited a rage that swept through every settlement. The recruitment centers were overwhelmed again. Christine Bell quit her factory job to join the engineering corps. Brandon Clark left his teaching position to become a communications officer. Dr. Maria Santos volunteered for the medical ships, ready to save lives in the coming battles. General Marcus Cole gathered his command staff and laid out the strategy. They could not match the Xalthians in numbers or territory, but they could hit hard and fast, targeting key installations and destroying them before reinforcements arrived. The goal was not to conquer Xalthian space, but to cripple their military capability and force them to release the prisoners. If the Xalthians refused, humanity would burn their empire to ash. The first target was chosen, a mining outpost on the edge of Xalthian territory. It was lightly defended and served as a supply depot for nearby fleets. Admiral Hughes assigned the mission to Captain Eric Lane, commander of the destroyer Rampage. Eric was young for a captain, but he had proven himself in simulations and training exercises. His tactical officer was Lieutenant Ashley Morgan, a sharp woman who could calculate firing solutions faster than the computer. The Rampage jumped into the system with 2 escort ships. They found the outpost exactly where intelligence said it would be. 3 Xalthian ships guarded it. Older vessels with outdated weapons. Eric ordered the attack. The human ships opened fire with their new plasma cannons. The beams cut through Xalthian shields and armor, crippling one ship in the first volley. The battle lasted 15 minutes. The Xalthian defenders fought back, but they were unprepared for the ferocity of the human attack. Eric's ship took several hits, but Ashley kept the shields strong. They destroyed all 3 enemy vessels and bombarded the outpost until nothing remained but debris. Then they jumped away before reinforcements could arrive. News of the attack spread quickly. The Xalthians had lost an outpost to a species they considered primitive. Their military command was confused and angry. How had the humans' the war spread across the stars like wildfire? Admiral Patricia Hughes commanded the main fleet from the Bridge of the Vengeance, leading humanity's forces deeper into Xalthian territory. She did not believe in cautious tactics or slow advances. Every battle was fought with the goal of complete victory. The Xalthians had terrorized humanity with brutality. She would respond with overwhelming force. The Battle of Theta Station became the first major engagement of the war. The Xalthians had built a massive weapons platform orbiting a strategic gas giant. It controlled the jump routes into 3 star systems and served as a resupply point for their fleets. Intelligence officer Sophie Barnes had identified it as a critical target. If humanity could destroy it, they would cut off an entire sector of Xalthian space. Captain Ryan Mitchell led the assault. He had been promoted after discovering the Colonial Dawn and given command of a fighter squadron. His ships were fast and deadly, equipped with the new plasma weapons that could punch through enemy shields. His wingman was Lieutenant Sarah Grant, Nicole's younger sister, who flew with the same fearless skill. Together they led 60 fighters against a Xalthian defense force 3 times their size. The battle was brutal. Xalthian fighters swarmed around the station, their weapons tearing through the first wave of human ships. Ryan watched his squadron take heavy losses, but kept pushing forward. Sarah flew alongside him, her ship dancing through enemy fire with incredible precision. She locked onto 2 Xalthian cruisers and fired her torpedoes in quick succession. Both ships exploded, opening a gap in their defensive line. Ryan led his remaining fighters through the gap, targeting the station's power core. The defenders threw everything at them. Laser fire filled the space around the station like a deadly web. Ships exploded on both sides, the vacuum lit up with fireballs that quickly faded. Ryan's fighter took a direct hit that knocked out his shields, but he kept flying. He had one shot at this. He fired his last torpedo and watched it streak toward the target. The explosion was massive. The station's power core went critical, triggering a chain reaction that tore the entire structure apart. Debris scattered in all directions. The Xalthian fleet tried to regroup, but without the station's support, they were vulnerable. Admiral Hughes brought in the main fleet and finished them. When the battle ended, the Xalthians had lost Theta Station and over 60 ships. Humanity had lost 40 fighters and hundreds of brave pilots. Ryan survived, but his squadron was decimated. The victory proved that humanity could win major battles, but the cost was heavy. Admiral Hughes understood that they could not sustain such losses forever. They needed to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless. She met with General Marcus Cole to plan the next phase of the campaign. Marcus had been studying Xalthian tactics and noticed a pattern. The aliens relied on their reputation and superior numbers. They did not adapt quickly when faced with unexpected strategies. Marcus proposed a new approach: hit and run attacks across multiple systems simultaneously. Divide the Xalthian forces and destroy them piecemeal before they could concentrate their strength. It would require precise coordination and brave crews willing to operate deep behind enemy lines. Admiral Hughes approved the plan and began assigning missions to her best captains. The ground war began when General Helen Foster led the first planetary invasion. The target was a Xalthian colony world that housed a military academy and training facility. Helen was a stern woman with a tactical mind that had made her famous during the Mars Rebellion. She commanded the Second Fleet, a force of 30 warships and 10,000 Marines. Sergeant Kevin Hayes was among the first to land. His transport ship broke through the atmosphere under heavy fire, shaking violently as Xalthian anti-aircraft batteries tried to shoot them down. Kevin gripped his rifle and watched his Marines prepare for combat. They had trained for this moment for months. Now they would show the Xalthians what human soldiers could do on the ground. The landing was rough. Several transport ships were hit and crashed, killing everyone aboard. Kevin's ship made it down, and the ramp dropped. He led his team out into a storm of enemy fire. The Xalthian soldiers were tall and fast, equipped with energy weapons that could burn through armor. But they had never faced humans in close combat. Kevin's Marines charged forward with a ferocity that shocked the defenders. The fighting was savage. Kevin used his combat training to devastating effect, moving through enemy positions with brutal efficiency. His team cleared buildings room by room, showing no mercy to soldiers who had likely participated in the murder and enslavement of humans. Medic Julia Ross followed close behind, treating wounded Marines under fire. She saved dozens of lives that day, often while bullets flew around her. The battle for the planet lasted 3 days. General Foster's forces pushed the Xalthians back steadily, taking their fortifications one by one. The aliens fought desperately but could not match the intensity of human soldiers fighting for revenge. When the last Xalthian stronghold fell, the planet was under human control. The military academy was destroyed, and every Xalthian soldier was either dead or had fled into space. Back on Earth, the war effort continued to expand. Dr. Laura Green unveiled her latest weapon: kinetic bombardment satellites. These devices could be deployed in enemy star systems and programmed to drop asteroids on military targets. The asteroids would be accelerated to incredible speeds, turning them into planet-killing projectiles. Admiral Hughes approved their use against Xalthian military installations, but forbade targeting civilian populations. Humanity would not become the monsters they were fighting. Intelligence operations became crucial as the war progressed. Sophie Barnes had finally cracked the Xalthian communication codes with Nathan Cruz's help. They could now intercept enemy transmissions and learn about fleet movements, supply routes, and military plans. Sophie discovered something that changed everything: the locations of the labor camps where human prisoners were held. There were 17 camps scattered across Xalthian space, each holding between 100 and 800 human colonists. The prisoners were forced to work in mines, factories, and construction projects. The conditions were designed to break them physically and mentally. Many had already died from exhaustion, disease, or punishment for disobedience. But thousands still survived, waiting for rescue. Admiral Hughes immediately redirected resources to mount rescue operations. She assigned Captain Frank Wallace to lead the missions. Frank was a Special Forces veteran who had spent years training for hostage rescue. He was calm under pressure and ruthless when necessary. His team included the best soldiers humanity had, all volunteers who understood the risks of operating deep in enemy territory. The first rescue mission targeted a mining camp on a remote asteroid. Frank's team approached in a stealth ship, avoiding Xalthian patrols. They landed under cover of darkness and moved silently toward the camp. The guards never saw them coming. Frank's team eliminated the Zalthian soldiers quickly and efficiently, then began evacuating the prisoners. Among those rescued was Timothy Brooks, the son of Amy Brooks, who had died in the executions. Timothy was thin and scarred, his body bearing the marks of 12 years of brutal labor, but his eyes burned with determination when Frank told him they were taking him home. Timothy helped organize the other prisoners, getting them aboard the rescue ship as quietly as possible. They escaped just before Xalthian reinforcements arrived. The freed colonists were brought back to human space, where they received medical treatment and counseling. Timothy's story was broadcast across all channels. He spoke about watching his mother die, about the years of slavery, about the friends who had not survived. But he also spoke about hope. He had never stopped believing that humanity would come for them. Now he wanted to join the fight. Within a week, Timothy enlisted in the military, determined to help free the others still in captivity. More rescue missions followed. Captain Wallace became specialized in liberating camps, his tactics studied by every special operations team. Each successful rescue brought more colonists home and provided valuable intelligence about Xalthian operations. The prisoners told of brutal conditions, casual cruelty, and a complete disregard for human life. Their testimonies only strengthened humanity's resolve to see this war through to the end. The Xalthians finally began to understand they were in serious trouble. They had lost entire sectors of space. Their fleets were being destroyed faster than they could replace them. Subject species within their empire watched humanity's victories and began to rebel. Planets that had been conquered centuries ago saw an opportunity for freedom. The empire that had stood for 10,000 years was starting to crack. Commander Nicole Grant had become famous as a fighter pilot. Her squadron, known as Grant's Ghosts, had the highest kill count in the fleet. Nicole flew with a reckless courage that made her both feared and admired. She had lost count of how many enemy ships she had destroyed. Each victory was for the colonists who had died, for the families torn apart, for the justice that still needed to be served. During a battle near the Krell Nebula, Nicole's squadron encountered a new type of Zalthian fighter. These ships were faster and more heavily armed than anything they had seen before. The Zalthians were finally adapting to human tactics. The battle turned into a deadly dance of skill and speed. Nicole took 3 direct hits that nearly destroyed her fighter, but she kept flying through sheer determination. She managed to take out the lead enemy ship before her system started failing. Sarah Grant, flying nearby, saw her sister's ship smoking and losing power. She broke formation and positioned herself between Nicole and the enemy fighters. Taking fire meant for her sister. Sarah's ship was hit hard, but she gave Nicole time to retreat. Both sisters made it back to the carrier, their ships barely holding together. It was a close call that reminded everyone how dangerous this war had become. General Marcus Cole reviewed the battle reports and felt the weight of command. They were winning battles, but losing good people. The casualty lists grew longer each week. Still, there was no choice but to continue. The Xalthians had made this war inevitable when they murdered innocent colonists. Humanity would not stop until every prisoner was freed and justice was delivered. Admiral Hughes planned the next major offensive. The target was a Xalthian shipyard that produced most of their warships. Destroying it would cripple their ability to replace losses. The mission would require the entire fleet and would be the biggest battle of the war so far. She called together her commanders and laid out the plan. They would strike hard, destroy the shipyard, and retreat before the Xalthian main fleet could respond. The preparations took weeks. Every ship was repaired and restocked. New weapons were installed. Fresh crews rotated in to replace those who needed rest. Dr. Victoria Lane provided upgraded plasma cannons that could burn even hotter. Andrew Ross had improved the shield generators, making them more efficient and longer lasting. The fleet was as ready as it would ever be. 3 years into the war, the Xalthian Empire was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Admiral Patricia Hughes studied the maps in her command center and saw a galaxy transformed. Over 60 star systems had fallen to human forces. The great empire that had ruled for 10 millennia was shrinking, its fleets scattered and weakened. But the war was far from over. The Xalthian core worlds remained untouched, protected by their most powerful fleets and strongest defenses. General Marcus Cole joined her to plan what they hoped would be the final offensive. They called it Operation Righteous Fury. The goal was to strike at the heart of the empire, destroying its military capability and forcing a surrender. It would be the biggest and most dangerous operation humanity had ever attempted. 20 battle groups would need to coordinate across dozens of systems, hitting multiple targets simultaneously to prevent the Xalthians from concentrating their forces. Commander Jake Morrison now led the 5th Fleet. He had risen through the ranks quickly, his tactical brilliance and fearless leadership earning him rapid promotions. But the war had changed him. His eyes held a hardness that came from 3 years of constant fighting. He still thought about Linda every day, still carried her picture in his pocket. Every battle was fought in her memory. Every enemy ship destroyed was a small piece of justice for what had been taken from him. Captain Ryan Mitchell commanded the advanced scouts. His job was to probe enemy defenses and identify weaknesses before the main fleet arrived. It was dangerous work that required skill and courage. Ryan's hair had gone completely gray from the stress of war. He had survived more battles than he could count, watched too many friends die. But he never hesitated when given a mission. The Xalthians had started this war by attacking innocent people. He would help finish it. The operation began at the Krell Nebula, a massive cloud of gas and dust that hid several Xalthian military installations. 1,500 human ships gathered for the assault, the largest fleet ever assembled. Admiral Hughes commanded from the Vengeance, with General Foster leading the ground forces. The Xalthian defenders numbered over 2,000 ships, veterans of countless battles who would fight to protect their empire's core territory. The battle started with a massive barrage. Human ships fired every weapon they had, filling space with plasma beams and missiles. The Xalthian shields absorbed the first volleys, but the sustained assault began to break them down. Captain Eric Lane's destroyer was in the thick of the fighting, dodging enemy fire while Lieutenant Ashley Morgan coordinated targeting solutions. Their ship took a direct hit that knocked out half their systems, but Ashley kept working, manually calculating firing angles and keeping their weapons active. Nicole Grant led her fighter squadron through the chaos. The Ghosts had become legends, feared by the Xalthians and admired by every human pilot. Nicole flew with the same fearless intensity that had made her famous. Her reflexes so fast that enemy fire rarely touched her. She led her team against the Xalthian flagship, a massive battleship that anchored their defensive line. The flagship's point defense systems destroyed half her squadron, but Nicole kept coming. She fired her torpedoes at point-blank range, trusting her skill to get her through the explosion. The torpedoes hit, and the flagship's shields collapsed. The main fleet poured fire into the breach, tearing the mighty ship apart. The Xalthian commander died with his vessel, and his fleet began to falter. Admiral Hughes pressed the advantage, ordering all ships to push forward. The human fleet surged through the enemy formation, breaking their lines and creating chaos among their ranks. Sergeant Kevin Hayes had a different mission. His Marines had been assigned to capture a Xalthian command carrier, a massive ship that coordinated fleet operations. Kevin led a boarding team of 50 Marines, the best close combat fighters humanity had. Their transport ship crashed into the carrier's hangar bay, and the Marines charged out into a storm of enemy fire. The Xalthians were good soldiers, but they had never fought humans in confined spaces. Kevin's team moved through the ship with brutal efficiency, clearing each section with tactics perfected over 3 years of war. The fighting inside the carrier was savage. Xalthian soldiers tried to stop the human advance, but Kevin's Marines used every dirty trick they had learned. They set traps, used ambushes, and showed no mercy to an enemy that had shown none to human colonists. Julia Ross, the medic who had been with Kevin since the beginning, treated wounded Marines between firefights. She had seen so much death and suffering that nothing shocked her anymore. She just kept working, keeping her soldiers alive so they could keep fighting. After 6 hours of brutal combat, Kevin's team reached the carrier's bridge. The Xalthian commander, Admiral Vothkar, stood waiting with his personal guard. Kevin recognized him from intelligence briefings. This was the officer who had orchestrated the Colonial Dawn massacre. This was the monster who had ordered the execution of 2,000 innocent women and children. Kevin's rage was cold and controlled as he engaged the guards. The fight was short and violent. Kevin's combat skills were superior, honed by years of warfare. He killed the guards and stood before Vothkar. The Xalthian admiral showed no fear, only contempt. He declared that humans were an inferior species that deserved extermination. Kevin knocked him unconscious and dragged him back to the transport ship. Vothkar would stand trial for his crimes. The battle raged for 18 hours, the longest sustained combat of the war. When it finally ended, the Xalthian fleet was destroyed. Over 1,000 of their ships were wreckage floating in space. The humans had lost 400 vessels, a terrible price, but they had broken the Empire's defensive line. The path to the core worlds was open. Admiral Vothkar was brought before a military tribunal aboard the Vengeance. The proceedings were broadcast across both human and Xalthian space. Dr. Grace Meyer translated every word as, the Xalthian officer was charged with war crimes, mass murder, and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings from the Colonial Dawn showed everything. The testimony of freed prisoners detailed the horror of the labor camps. General Helen Foster presided over the tribunal. She listened to all the evidence, heard Vothkar's defense. The Xalthian showed no remorse. He declared that the executions were necessary to maintain order. Humans had invaded Xalthian space without permission. The punishment was death. He had simply carried out his duty as an officer of the Empire. The deaths meant nothing to him. Helen's verdict was swift and absolute. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by the same method Vothkar had used on human women. Hanging. The execution was carried out publicly, broadcast across the galaxy. It was justice delivered. A message that humanity would hold its enemies accountable for their crimes. The Xalthians watched one of their highest-ranking military commanders die in disgrace, and fear began to spread through their ranks. Captain Frank Wallace continued his rescue operations. He had become the best in the business, his teams liberating camp after camp. His latest mission took him to a facility where human prisoners had been forced to build weapons for the Xalthian military. The conditions were even worse than usual. Prisoners who could not work were simply executed. Disease was rampant. The guards were particularly cruel, taking pleasure in the suffering of their captives. Frank's team hit the camp at night, using stealth technology that Sophie Barnes had helped develop. They eliminated the guards silently and began evacuating prisoners. Among those rescued was Dr. Paul Brooks, Timothy's father. Paul had survived by pretending to cooperate with the Xalthians while secretly sabotaging the weapons he built, small defects that would not be noticed until the weapons failed in combat. It was a tiny rebellion, but it was all he could do. When Paul was brought aboard the rescue ship and saw Timothy waiting for him, the reunion was emotional. Father and son had not seen each other in 12 years. Timothy had been a boy when they were captured. Now he was a man, a soldier fighting to free others like his father. Paul wept when Timothy told him that Amy had been one of the first to die. She had died, singing, brave until the end. Paul's grief was mixed with pride. His wife had faced death with courage, and his son had grown into a fine man who honored her memory by fighting for justice. The freed prisoners were given a choice: return to civilian life or join the war effort. Most chose to fight. Paul and Timothy both enlisted on the cruiser Justice, commanded by Captain Lisa Hammond. Lisa had been promoted after years of distinguished service. Her ship was named for the cause they all believed in. She welcomed the Brooks family aboard and gave them positions where they could contribute to the war effort. Dr. Laura Green achieved another breakthrough in her research. She developed a device that could disrupt Xalthian communications across an entire sector. The jamming system would blind enemy fleets, preventing them from coordinating their defenses. Admiral Hughes immediately saw the potential. If they could deploy these devices during an assault on the Xalthian capital, they could create enough chaos to break through the defenses. The Xalthian Emperor, Zothran the Eternal, finally addressed the conflict directly. His image was broadcast across the galaxy. A tall figure in elaborate robes, speaking from his throne on Xalthia Prime. He acknowledged that the war had gone badly for the Empire. Humanity had proven itself a formidable opponent. But he offered a path to peace. The Empire would return all human prisoners and pay reparations. Humanity would be welcomed as a client species within the Empire, with autonomy over their own worlds. The past could be forgiven and forgotten. The response from Earth was written by Jennifer Cole, a war correspondent who had covered every major battle. Jennifer was General Marcus Cole's daughter, a journalist who had embedded with combat units to tell the story of humanity's struggle. Her words were broadcast across all human channels and transmitted to every Xalthian world. She said that the Emperor could return the prisoners. He could offer all the wealth of the Empire, but he could not give back the lives of those who had been murdered. He could not undo 12 years of slavery and suffering. Forgiveness was not possible for crimes of such magnitude. The war would continue until the Xalthian Empire ceased to exist. There would be no peace, no compromise, no mercy for those who had shown none to innocent people. The message was clear and uncompromising. Humanity would accept nothing less than total victory. The Xalthians had tried to terrify Earth into submission by killing women and children. Instead, they had created an enemy that would never stop, never surrender, never forget. The empire that had ruled for 10,000 years would fall because they had made the fatal mistake of underestimating human determination. Admiral Hughes began planning the assault on Xalthia Prime. Every resource humanity had would be committed to this battle. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon would be thrown at the Xalthian homeworld. The operation would determine the outcome of the war. If they succeeded, the Empire would collapse. If they failed, the war could drag on for decades. There was no middle ground, no room for half measures. General Marcus Cole worked on the ground assault plans. Taking a heavily defended planet would require millions of soldiers and perfect coordination. The Xalthians would fight desperately to defend their homeworld. The casualties would be enormous. But there was no other way. The Empire's leadership had to be destroyed, its military broken beyond repair. Only then would the galaxy be safe from their cruelty. The preparations took months. New ships were built, replacing those lost in battle. Fresh troops were trained and equipped. The scientists provided every advantage they could create. Dr. Victoria Lane improved the plasma weapons one last time. Andrew Ross upgraded the shields to handle more punishment. Melissa Ford created new types of ammunition that would be even more effective against Xalthian armor. The night before the assault, Admiral Patricia Hughes could not sleep. She stood in her quarters aboard the Vengeance, looking at the star maps displayed on her wall. Xalthia Prime glowed red on the display, surrounded by defensive rings that represented the most powerful military fortifications in the galaxy. Tomorrow, she would lead 3,000 ships against those defenses. Tens of thousands of people would die. But there was no other way to end this war. She thought about the journey that had brought humanity to this moment. 4 years ago, they had been peaceful explorers, reaching for the stars with hope and wonder. Then the Xalthians had shattered that innocence with an act of such cruelty that it changed everything. The Empire had tried to break humanity's spirit by murdering innocent women and children. Instead, they had awakened a fury that would consume them. Admiral Hughes walked to the bridge and sent a message to every ship in the fleet. Her words were simple, but carried the weight of 4 years of war. She reminded them why they fought, not for conquest or glory, but for justice. For the mothers and daughters who had died singing songs of Earth. For the fathers and sons who had suffered in slavery. For a future where humanity would never again be helpless against those who would harm them. Commander Jake Morrison received the message aboard his flagship. He sat in his command chair, Linda's picture in his hand, and read the Admiral's words. 4 years of fighting had brought him to this moment. Every battle, every loss, every small victory had been building toward this final confrontation. He put the picture back in his pocket and called his officers to their stations. The Fifth Fleet was ready. Captain Ryan Mitchell prepared his scouts. Their job was crucial. Deploy the communication jammers that would blind the Zalthian defenses. Ryan had handpicked his team, choosing pilots who could fly through the defensive grid and survive long enough to place the devices. It was a suicide mission for most of them. Ryan did not pretend otherwise. He told them the odds and gave them a chance to back out. Nobody did. They all knew what was at stake. General Marcus Cole stood with his ground forces in the massive troop carriers. 2 million soldiers waited to land on Exalthia Prime once the orbital defenses fell. Marcus walked among them, shaking hands and offering words of encouragement. Many were young, barely out of training. Others were veterans who had fought since the war began. All of them were volunteers who understood they might not survive the day, but they were ready to fight for a cause larger than themselves. General Helen Foster commanded the Second Fleet. Her ships would strike from the southern axis, while Admiral Hughes attacked from the north. The Zalthians would have to divide their forces, creating opportunities for both fleets to break through. Helen had studied the defensive layouts for months, searching for weaknesses. She had found a few, but nothing that guaranteed success. This battle would be won by courage and determination, not clever tactics. Sergeant Kevin Hayes checked his equipment one last time. His Marines would be the first to land, securing beachheads for the main army. Kevin had fought on a dozen worlds during the war. He had seen every kind of combat and survived situations that should have killed him. But this would be different. The Xalthians would defend their homeworld with everything they had. The fighting would be brutal beyond anything they had experienced before. Kevin looked at his squad, men and women he had trained and fought alongside for years. He told them to stay sharp and watch each other's backs. They would need every bit of skill and luck to survive. The assault began at dawn, Xalthia prime time. Captain Mitchell's scouts jumped into the system first. Their small ships appearing near the outer defensive ring. Xalthian sensors detected them immediately, and defensive platforms opened fire. Mitchell's team scattered, each pilot racing toward their assigned position, the space around them filled with weapons fire, a deadly web of lasers and missiles that destroyed half the scouts in the first minute. Ryan flew through the chaos with the skill earned from 4 years of combat. His ship took several hits, alarms screaming as systems failed, but he kept flying. He reached his position and deployed the communication jammer, a small device that would disrupt Xalthian signals across an entire sector. Around him, other scouts did the same. The devices activated simultaneously, and the Xalthian communication network collapsed. Defensive platforms lost coordination. Fleet commanders could not talk to each other. Chaos spread through the defenders. Admiral Hughes gave the order, and the main fleet jumped in. 3,000 human warships appeared in Xalthian space, the largest military force ever assembled. The ships formed attack formations and surged toward the planet. The Xalthian orbital fleet tried to respond, but without communications, they could not coordinate their defense. Individual ships fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and ferocity of the human assault. The Vengeance led the charge, Admiral Hughes directing the battle from her command chair. The flagship's plasma cannons fired continuously, burning through enemy shields and armor. Beside her, the Retribution and Fury added their firepower. The Xalthian orbital stations fought back desperately, their weapons taking a heavy toll on the attackers. Human ships exploded by the dozens, but there were always more pressing forward. Commander Nicole Grant led her fighter squadron in the attack on the orbital command station. The Ghosts had fought in every major battle of the war, and this would be their greatest challenge. The station was protected by point defense systems that could track and destroy fighters with deadly accuracy. Nicole lost ship after ship from her squadron, watching friends die in explosions of fire and metal. But she kept coming, her focus absolute. She dodged through the defensive fire with reflexes that seemed superhuman. Her ship took 3 direct hits that nearly tore it apart, but somehow she kept flying. She got close enough to fire her torpedoes at the station's critical systems. The weapons hit, and explosions rippled across the station's surface. Nicole pulled away, her ship barely functioning, as the station began to break apart. The Xalthian Orbital Command was destroyed. With the command station gone, the remaining defenses lost what little coordination they had left. Admiral Hughes ordered the final push. The human fleet converged on the orbital platforms, destroying them one by one. The battle lasted 18 hours of continuous fighting. Ships fought until their weapons ran dry or their engines failed. Crews pushed their vessels beyond safe limits, knowing that everything depended on breaking through. Captain Eric Lane's destroyer was hit by a massive energy blast that should have destroyed it. Lieutenant Ashley Morgan kept the tactical systems running through sheer willpower, manually rerouting power and calculating firing solutions even as the ship fell apart around her. They managed to take out 2 more Xalthian cruisers before their reactor finally gave out. Eric ordered everyone to evacuate, and his crew escaped in life pods moments before the ship exploded. When the orbital battle finally ended, Xalthia Prime's defenses were shattered. Over 400 human ships had been destroyed. 30,000 sailors and pilots were dead, but the Xalthian orbital fleet was annihilated. The planet lay exposed below, vulnerable to invasion. Admiral Hughes sent the signal to General Marcus Cole. Begin the landing. The troop carriers descended through the atmosphere under a protective screen of fighters. Xalthian anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with explosions. Some carriers were hit and crashed, killing everyone aboard. But most made it through, landing in the designated zones around the capital city. The ramps dropped, and soldiers poured out into battle. Sergeant Kevin Hayes hit the ground running. His Marines spread out, securing the landing zone against Xalthian soldiers who rushed to defend their homeworld. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Kevin led his team forward, using every tactic he had learned over 4 years of war. The Xalthians fought with the desperation of people defending their homes, but human soldiers fought with the fury of people seeking justice for terrible crimes. The battle spread across the planet's surface. General Marcus Cole directed the operation from his command center, coordinating the movements of 2 million soldiers. The Xalthians had pulled back to defend their cities, creating fortified positions that would have to be taken one by one. Marcus ordered his forces to advance carefully, using superior firepower to break enemy strongpoints before sending in ground troops. Dr. Laura Green accompanied a special team searching for research facilities. Intelligence had indicated that the Xalthians conducted experiments on captured species, trying to understand their biology for future wars. What they found was worse than expected. Hidden laboratories beneath the capital city held evidence of horrific experiments on human prisoners. People had been subjected to torture disguised as research, their suffering documented in clinical detail. Laura and her team carefully recorded everything, preserving evidence of the Xalthian crimes. The researchers who had conducted these experiments were captured and held for trial. Their work showed a casual cruelty that made even hardened soldiers sick. These discoveries only reinforced why the war had to be fought. The Xalthian Empire had to be destroyed to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Meanwhile, Sophie Barnes led a special operations team with a specific mission: capture Emperor Zothran alive. Intelligence had tracked him to the Imperial Palace, a massive structure in the heart of the capital. Sophie's team included the best soldiers humanity had, experts in infiltration and close combat. They approached the palace under cover of the battle raging outside. The palace was defended by the Emperor's elite guards, warriors who had trained their entire lives to protect the imperial family. Sophie's team fought their way inside, room by room, corridor by corridor. The guards were skilled and determined, but the human soldiers had 4 years of combat experience and a burning desire for justice. They pushed deeper into the palace, leaving dead guards behind them. They found Emperor Zothran in his throne room, surrounded by the last of his guards and his closest advisors. The advisors urged him to flee, to escape, while there was still time. But Zothran refused. He stood before his throne, declaring that an emperor did not run from inferior species. He would face the humans and show them that the Xalthian Empire would never truly fall. Sophie's team burst into the throne room, and a final battle erupted. The elite guards fought with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. When the last guard fell, Sophie stood before the Emperor with her weapon raised. Zothran looked at her with contempt, expecting to be executed. Instead, Sophie told him he would stand trial for his crimes. He would face justice in front of the entire galaxy. The fighting on Xalthia Prime continued for 3 days. The Xalthian soldiers fought for every street and building, but they could not stop the human advance. General Helen Foster's forces pushed into the southern cities, while Marcus Cole's army took the north. Slowly, methodically, they conquered the planet that had been the heart of the Empire for 10,000 years. When the last Xalthian stronghold fell, the war was effectively over. The Emperor was captured. The orbital defenses were destroyed. The military command was dead or surrendered. General Foster accepted the formal surrender of the remaining Xalthian forces on behalf of humanity. The terms were absolute: complete disarmament, dissolution of the Empire, freedom for all subject species, and war crimes trials for those responsible for atrocities. Emperor Zothran was brought before a galactic tribunal. Representatives from all the species the Xalthians had oppressed attended the trial. Dr. Grace Meyer translated the proceedings, ensuring everyone understood every word. The evidence against the Emperor was overwhelming. The recordings from the colonial dawn, the testimony of freed prisoners, the documentation of experiments and torture, the list of crimes was endless. Zothran showed no remorse during the trial. He declared that everything he had done was necessary to maintain order in the galaxy. The execution of human women was meant to prevent a larg. The war was over, but the work of building peace had only just begun. In the central square of Xalthia Prime, where Xalthian commanders had once executed human women as a show of dominance, construction crews built something different. A memorial rose from the ground. Black stone carved with the names of every colonist from the colonial dawn. The names of the murdered women filled one side of the monument. The names of those who had died in slavery filled another. At the base, workers installed an eternal flame that would burn forever as a reminder. Captain Ryan Mitchell stood before the partially completed memorial, reading through the names. He had been given the honor of activating the flame when construction finished. It seemed fitting that the man who had discovered the colonial dawn would be the one to light the memorial. But Ryan felt no sense of triumph or closure. The names carved in stone represented real people, families torn apart, lives ended too soon. Victory in war could never truly compensate for such loss. Lisa Hammond found him there. She had been promoted to captain of the Justice after 4 years of distinguished service. Her sister Beth's name was on the memorial, one of 2,000 women who had died singing songs of Earth. Lisa stood beside Ryan in silence for a long time before speaking. She said that Beth would have been proud to see how humanity had responded. The Xalthians had tried to make them afraid, but instead, they had made them angry. That anger had toppled an empire. Around them, work crews continued their labor. Many were freed colonists who had chosen to help build the memorial. Timothy Brooks worked alongside his father Paul, both men finding some measure of peace in the physical labor. They had survived 12 years of slavery and then fought in the war that freed them. Now they were helping create something that would ensure the dead were never forgotten. Amy Brooks' name was already carved in the stone. Timothy ran his fingers over the letters, remembering his mother's voice, her strength, her courage. The galaxy was transforming rapidly. The Xalthian Empire had controlled 400 star systems, ruling over dozens of subject species for thousands of years. With the empire dissolved, those species were finally free. Some immediately declared independence and began building their own governments. Others struggled with the sudden change, uncertain how to govern themselves after centuries of Xalthian rule. Humanity offered assistance, but did not impose control. They had fought to end an empire, not to build their own. General Marcus Cole retired from military service 1 week after the war ended. He had spent 4 years planning battles and sending people to die. The weight of command had aged him beyond his years. At his retirement ceremony, he spoke briefly about the cost of war. Over 200,000 humans had died in the fighting. Thousands more had been wounded or traumatized. The victory was real, but it had been purchased with blood and grief. He urged the next generation to remember that lesson and to seek peace whenever possible. Admiral Patricia Hughes remained in command of Earth's military forces. The war had proven that the galaxy was dangerous and that humanity needed to stay strong. She oversaw the transformation of the wartime fleet into a defensive force. Many ships were decommissioned and scrapped, their materials used for peaceful construction, but enough remained to ensure that humanity would never again be caught unprepared. The Admiral was determined that no species would ever again think they could terrorize humans with impunity. Commander Jake Morrison finally went home. He returned to Earth for the first time in 5 years and visited the cemetery where Linda had been memorialized, along with the other Colonial Dawn victims. Her body had never been recovered, but there was a marker with her name. Jake stood before it and told her about the war, about the battles fought in her name, about the empire that had fallen because they had dared to hurt her. Then, he said goodbye. He had carried his grief and rage for so long that putting them down felt strange. But the war was over. Justice had been served. It was time to try living again. Nicole Grant retired from military service and became a flight instructor. She had survived 4 years of combat, defying odds that should have killed her 100 times over. But she was tired of war, tired of watching friends die, tired of the nightmares that came every night. Teaching young pilots seemed like a way to give back without having to fight anymore. Her sister Sarah joined her, and together the Grant sisters trained the next generation of pilots. They told stories about the war, about the sacrifices made, about the importance of being ready to defend what mattered. Sergeant Kevin Hayes stayed in the military, but moved to a training role. He had seen enough combat for one lifetime. Instead, he taught Marines the skills they would need if war ever came again. Kevin was direct and harsh in his training, pushing his students harder than they thought they could endure. But he explained that he trained them hard because he wanted them to survive. The war had taught him that skill and preparation were the difference between life and death. Every Marine he trained was someone who might survive the next war. Dr. Laura Green returned to research, but her focus had changed. Instead of weapons, she now worked on defensive technology, shields that could protect civilian vessels from attack, early warning systems that could detect hostile fleets, medical technology to help heal the wounded. She had helped create the weapons that won the war. Now she wanted to create things that would prevent the next one. Her work was quieter than before, less dramatic, but she found it more satisfying. The war crimes trials continued for months. Hundreds of Xalthian military officers and government officials were brought before galactic tribunals. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Recordings of atrocities, testimony from survivors, documentation of crimes that had continued for centuries. Some defendants showed remorse and cooperated fully. Others, like Emperor Zothran, remained defiant until the end. All were found guilty. Sentences ranged from long imprisonment to execution, depending on the severity of their crimes. The labor camps where humans had been enslaved were completely dismantled. Captain Frank Wallace led teams that searched every former Xalthian facility, looking for any prisoners who might have been missed. They found a few survivors in forgotten camps, people who had been abandoned when the Empire collapsed. Every human was brought home and given medical care, counseling, and support to rebuild their lives. The scars, both physical and mental, would never fully heal. But they were free. The freed colonists faced difficult choices about their futures. Some wanted to return to Earth, to familiar surroundings and the comfort of home. Others felt that going back would dishonor the sacrifice of those who had died seeking new worlds. These survivors chose to establish a new colony, built on a planet in what had been Zalthian space. They named it New Dawn, in memory of the colonial dawn and the future that had been stolen from them. The colony became a symbol of hope, proof that humanity would not be deterred from exploring the stars. Jennifer Cole, the war correspondent, wrote a comprehensive history of the conflict. Her book documented every major battle, every significant decision, every sacrifice made in the pursuit of justice. She interviewed hundreds of veterans, collecting their stories and preserving them for future generations. The book became required reading in schools across human space. Jennifer wanted to ensure that people never forgot why the war had been necessary and what it had cost to win. Dr. Grace Meyer continued her work as a linguist, but now she focused on communication between species. The galaxy needed to learn to talk to each other, to resolve disputes peacefully before they escalated into violence. Grace established a school for diplomats, teaching them not just languages but cultural understanding. She believed that many conflicts began with misunderstanding, and that better communication could prevent future wars. Her students went on to become ambassadors and negotiators, building bridges between species. The memorial on Xalthia Prime was completed 6 months after the war ended. The dedication ceremony was attended by thousands. Veterans came from across human space to pay their respects. Freed colonists stood beside soldiers who had fought to rescue them. Families of the dead gathered to see their loved ones' names carved in stone. Admiral Hughes gave a speech about sacrifice and remembrance. General Foster talked about the cost of justice. Then, Captain Ryan Mitchell stepped forward to light the eternal flame. Ryan's hands shook as he held the torch. He thought about the day he had discovered the colonial dawn, floating silent and empty in space. He thought about watching the recordings of the executions, seeing the courage of women who refused to let their murderers break their spirits. He thought about 4 years of war, all the battles fought, all the friends lost. Then, he touched the torch to the prepared fuel, and the flame ignited. It burned bright and steady, a beacon of remembrance that would never be extinguished. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence. Thousands of people stood in the square where executions had once taken place, now transformed into a place of memory and peace. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackling of the eternal flame. Then, someone began to sing. It was one of the songs the women had sung as they died, a simple melody about earth and home and hope. Others joined in, voices rising together in harmony. The song that had been an act of defiance in the face of death became an affirmation of life and remembrance. Earth began the process of integrating back into normal life. The economy shifted from wartime production to peacetime construction. Factories that had built warships now built civilian vessels. Shipyards that had churned out destroyers now constructed colony ships and trading vessels. The transition was not easy, but humanity had proven its ability to adapt and overcome challenges. The species that had been forced into war now worked to build a better peace. The other species in the galaxy watched humanity with a mixture of respect and fear. They had seen a young species go from peaceful explorers to devastating warriors in the span of months. They had watched humanity topple an empire that had ruled for 10,000 years. Some species sought alliance with Earth, wanting the protection that came with human friendship. Others kept their distance, worried about what humanity might do next. All understood that the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted fundamentally. Admiral Hughes met with representatives from dozens of species, establishing treaties and trade agreements. She made clear that humanity sought peace, but would defend itself and its allies without hesitation. The message was simple. Treat humans fairly, and they would be loyal friends. Threaten them, or harm innocents, and they would respond with overwhelming force. The galaxy had learned this lesson through the fall of the Xalthian Empire. Hughes was determined that the lesson would not be forgotten. Commander Jake Morrison eventually remarried. He met a woman named Catherine, who had also lost someone in the war. They bonded over shared grief and slowly built something new together. Jake never forgot Linda, but he learned that remembering the dead did not mean stopping living. He and Catherine had children, and Jake told them stories about their namesake, the brave woman who had died trying to build a better future. The children grew up knowing they had a legacy to honor. Timothy and Paul Brooks started a foundation to help war veterans adjust to civilian life. They understood the challenges better than most, having been through slavery, war, and the difficult process of rebuilding. Their foundation provided counseling, job training, and community support for anyone struggling with the transition. Thousands of veterans found help through their work, learning that life after war was possible even when it seemed impossible. The galaxy slowly stabilized into a new order. The Xalthian Empire's former territory was divided among the freed species, with humans claiming only a few strategic systems for defense. Trade routes reopened, now free from the Empire's heavy taxes and restrictions. Scientific cooperation increased as species shared knowledge without fear of Xalthian interference. Art and culture flourished as different civilizations learned from each other. The galaxy was not perfect, but it was better than it had been. 10 years after the war ended, Captain Ryan Mitchell returned to Xalthia Prime for the memorial's anniversary ceremony. He was an old man now, his hair completely white, his body bearing the scars of decades in space, but his eyes were still sharp as he stood before the eternal flame. Thousands had gathered for the ceremony, but the crowd was different now. Many were young people who had been children during the war or born after it ended. They came to learn, to remember, to understand the price of the peace they enjoyed. Ryan spoke to them about the colonial dawn, about Amy Brooks and Dr. Helen Carter and Claire Watson and all the others whose names were carved in stone. He told them about the prisoners who suffered in labor camps for 12 years. He described the war that followed, the battles fought, the friends lost. But mostly, he talked about why it all mattered. The Xalthians had tried to use terror to break humanity's spirit. Instead, they had learned that some things cannot be broken. Justice, courage, and the determination to protect the innocent were stronger than any empire. The young people listened carefully, some taking notes, others simply standing in respectful silence. When Ryan finished speaking, he added one final thought. He said that the memorial existed not to glorify war but to remember its cost. The eternal flame burned so that people would never forget what happened when evil went unchallenged. It burned so that future generations would understand the responsibility they inherited. To stand against cruelty, to defend the helpless, and to never let fear prevent them from doing what was right. As the sun set over Xalthia Prime, the eternal flame burned brighter against the darkness. The names carved in stone stood as a permanent record of lives lost and justice served. And throughout the galaxy, humans and other species went about their lives, building futures that the colonial dawn colonists had dreamed of but never lived to see. The war was over. The empire had fallen. But the memory remained, preserved in stone and flame, and the hearts of all who knew the story. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson about humanity. They could be the best of friends or the worst of enemies. The choice was up to those who encountered them. But one thing was certain. They would never again be dismissed as weak or easily terrorized. The era of human expansion into the stars continued, but now it proceeded with the confidence born of hard-won victory and the knowledge that humanity could defend what it valued most. War. The enslavement of prisoners was standard practice for dealing with inferior species. He had only done what any emperor would do to protect his empire. The deaths meant nothing, because humans meant nothing. Admiral Patricia Hughes delivered the final judgment. She spoke about the colonists who had died, about the suffering of those enslaved, about the 4 years of war that could have been avoided if the Xalthians had shown even basic decency. The Emperor's actions had not prevented a war. They had guaranteed one. His empire had stood for 10,000 years, and he had destroyed it with a single act of cruelty. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all charges. The sentence was life imprisonment with no possibility of release. The Emperor would spend his remaining years in a cell, watching as everything he had built crumbled to dust. His throne world would be transformed into a memorial for all who had died in the war. The empire that had seemed eternal was ended, its legacy nothing but a warning to others who might follow the same path of conquest and cruelty. When everything was ready, Admiral Hughes called a meeting of all fleet commanders. The room was filled with the men and women who had led humanity through 3 years of brutal warfare. They had all lost friends and comrades. They had all seen horrors that would haunt them forever. But they had also seen humanity rise to meet an impossible challenge. They had turned a peaceful, exploring species into the most feared military force in the galaxy. Hughes gave them their final briefing. The assault on Xalthia Prime would begin in 1 week. Every ship would participate. Every soldier would be needed. The battle would be the hardest they had ever fought. Many would not survive, but they would win because failure was not an option. The colonists who had died deserved justice. The prisoners who had suffered deserved freedom. And humanity deserved a galaxy where such atrocities could never happen again. 1 week until they would bring war to the heart of the empire that had dared to harm innocent people. On the day of the attack, Admiral Hughes stood on the bridge of the Vengeance and looked at the fleet assembled around her flagship. Hundreds of ships waited for her orders, carrying thousands of brave men and women ready to fight and die for humanity. She thought about the colonists who had been murdered, the prisoners still suffering in camps, and the families back home depending on them to win this war. Then, she gave the order to jump. The fleet emerged in the target system and immediately engaged the defenders. The battle was massive, with ships fighting across millions of kilometers of space. The Xalthian shipyard was protected by powerful defensive platforms and a fleet of guard ships. But humanity came prepared. They hit the defenders with overwhelming firepower, using their new weapons to devastating effect. The shipyard began to burn, its construction bays exploding one by one. The Xalthians fought desperately to protect their vital facility, but they could not stop the human assault. When the fleet jumped away, the shipyard was a floating wreck that would never build another ship. Humanity had struck another devastating blow to the empire that had thought itself invincible, developed such powerful weapons so quickly. How had they known where to strike? The Xalthian Emperor called for a full military response. They would crush this upstart species and make an example of them. But on Earth, the successful raid was celebrated. Humanity had struck back. They had drawn blood. General Marcus Cole watched the celebration and felt a grim satisfaction. This was just the beginning. The Xalthians had awakened something in humanity that they did not understand. They had turned a peaceful, exploring species into warriors. They had made it personal by murdering innocents. Now they would learn what humanity was truly capable of when pushed beyond its limits. Admiral Hughes accelerated the fleet construction schedule. They had proven the new weapons worked. Now they needed to build enough ships to take the war deep into Xalthian territory. The forges burned hot. The shipyards never stopped. And volunteers kept coming. Earth was preparing for a war that would reshape the galaxy. And nothing would stop them until justice was served. Humanity had been peaceful, focused on exploration and building new homes among the stars. That age was ending. A new era was beginning, forged in rage and grief, and an unbreakable determination for justice. The Xalthians had wanted to send a message. They had succeeded, but the message humanity received was not the one they intended. Instead of fear, they had planted fury. Instead of submission, they had guaranteed war. The The council adjourned with orders flowing immediately to every military installation, every shipyard, every research facility. Earth was going to war, and it would not stop until justice was served.